All right, so what does it mean and what's next? Let's go to Israel. Standing by in Tel Aviv is Avi Melamed. He is a Middle East geopolitical intelligence analyst. Avi, good to see you on this Wednesday. Appreciate you taking the time for us in Canada, as always.
Hello, Todd. Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's start with the United States suspending those bombs, the shipments. What are we to make of that? How significant or not is it?
It's yet clear another illustration of the ongoing tension that has been building between the Israeli government and the Biden administration in the last couple of months vis-a-vis the whole way they are not necessarily looking at the whole conducting of the operation, but particularly in the context of the day after. I think that the two sides have a common goal in the sense that they do understand that Hamas rule in Gaza Strip must come to an end. But then there is the whole issue of the day after, and I think that it's very clear that there is a rift and differences of opinion, particularly between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Biden administration. And I think the recent American move has to be viewed in that context.
Avi, how big do you think this military operation by the Israelis in Rafah is going to be? Is it going to be targeted, or are we talking about what could be more like a full-scale invasion? What do you think?
Well, I think you're looking at a modular-based model, meaning that Israel will operate on phases, as we saw the other night when Israel took over the Rafah crossing. Each phase will be basically in dialogue, sort of speaking, with the trajectory of the negotiations over a potential deal regarding the releasing of Israeli hostages. So we are not looking at something that was, roughly speaking, the model of shock and awe that was in the early stage of this war, but we are looking rather at something that is much more modularized, something that is being built based upon phases, and it's all the time in an eye contact with the whole trajectory of the discussion with Hamas vis-a-vis the issue of releasing the Israeli hostages.
Yeah, and I want to get to the ceasefire talks in a moment, but can I ask you what you think the Israeli perspective is here? I mean, so many countries have said, do not go into Rafah. There's too many civilians there. You can't protect them. This is going to be a total disaster. The United States has also had a lot of concerns publicly and no doubt even more privately about not going into Rafah, and the Israelis have done it and are doing it regardless. Why?
Because Hamas committed a terrible attack on October 7, and it basically vows to commit another attack. Look, we have an ISIS-style entity next to Israel's neck, and that ISIS-style entity says we're going to do again what we did before. Now you can understand from an Israeli perspective the significance of the threat. I'm not so sure that the Western powers internalize the trauma of October 7 and the ramifications of that in the context of the Israeli public opinion. This is why.
Are you concerned about the deaths of civilians as a result of this operation now in Rafah?
I'm always concerned about death of civilians, but this is something that also have to be mentioned in the context of Western discussion. It's about time that the West will start holding Hamas accountable for what happens in Gaza Strip. Remember, Hamas governs Gaza Strip since 2007. It legislates laws. It has 30,000 military personnel. He charges taxes. It's a government in Gaza. It cannot be exempted from responsibility, neither to its actions nor to its ramifications of its actions. And it's about time that the West will start to internalize that. And the reason for that is very simple. As long as the West is not holding Hamas responsible, we will see additional and escalating scenarios of conflicts and violence between Israel and Gaza Strip. And I think that the West has to internalize that.
Let me ask you about the ceasefire talks ongoing now in Cairo, Egypt. How confident are you that we may see a deal? Avi, your thoughts?
I think that we could see a deal at some point. I think there is an increasing pressure on all sides from different perspectives to move forward towards some sort of a deal. And so I personally think that we could look forward and see some sort of a deal brewing up, sort of speaking. And I do hope it wouldn't take long before we will have at least some first practical phase of implementing such a deal. and I definitely hope that will be the case.
I want to ask you as well about domestic politics within Israel itself. And, there are critics who say that what's going on in Rafah is tied directly to Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister's own political future. That the longer this war goes on, the more he is able to stave off, political setbacks and possibly defeat for him politically. Is that accurate? What do you think? Is that fair criticism?
Well, I would say personally that I think that from Netanyahu's perspective, it's first and foremost not about his necessarily political endurance, but particularly about his legacy. I think it's important to remember that Netanyahu positioned itself all those years as a politician as Mr. Security. He basically presented himself as a defender of Israel. Following October 7, definitely that legacy or that assumption of Mr. Netanyahu is facing a very significant challenge. So I think that this is the major thing that guides Netanyahu's policy and actions on the ground. But this is my own personal opinion, of course.
If a ceasefire is signed, I wonder, does that lead to the fall of his government? As you know, there are hardliners there who are very concerned about any sort of ceasefire without an ongoing military offensive against Hamas. So Netanyahu is really sort of trying to walk that tightrope right now.
Yes, and we know that the right-wing factors in Netanyahu's government, Ben-Gvir Smotrich, has been very clearly threatening that the government will not last one day if there is going to be an agreement that will basically translate it as an Israeli defeat. The question, of course, is whether they will translate that necessarily as defeat. When it comes to politicians, you can always trust them to find some ways to, I would say, reshape reality in the way that comes along with their political objectives. The right-wing factors within Netanyahu government basically knows that currently they have a great influence in their hand, not necessarily the same scenario following upcoming elections in Israel. I'm not so sure that they will rush immediately to resign from that government.
Joining us from Tel Aviv, Avi is a Middle East geopolitical intelligence analyst in Israel today with his thoughts. Always good to see you, Avi. We appreciate you taking the time for us in Canada.
Of course, though. Thank you for having me.